Hey Book Dragons, welcome back to my channel. Glad you could be here. I've got a book review for you today. Let's get right to it. Thank you to my patrons. I really appreciate all you do to support the channel. So not long ago, I finished reading Leviathan Wakes. It is the first book in the Expanse book series, a book series comprised of 9 books. It is finished at this point. It is the series that spawned the TV series on Amazon Prime, titled The Expanse as well, and I will talk a little bit at the end of this video about the TV series, or at least about season 1. Let's get right into the review, guys, and then we'll talk about the show at the very end. So Leviathan Wakes is a space opera. It's the easiest way to put it. It is a science fiction series, and it takes place in Earth's near future. A lot of people compare it to Game of Thrones in space, and I think that's warranted to a point. There's a lot of political maneuvering that goes on. There's a lot of major figureheads that are competing against each other for control of the solar system and control of a specific precious resource, which we'll get into a little bit later on in the review, so I won't talk about that much. But I think it does deserve that comparison to a point. But at the same time, it's sci-fi, right? So it stands completely on its own. It is set in a world where humans have colonized Mars and the far reaches of the asteroid belt and a few other planets as well, in terms of scientific exploration. And the book is centered around a catastrophe that happens where an ice hauler called the Canterbury is destroyed for unknown reasons. Some people think it's Mars that attacked the Canterbury. Some people think it's the belt. There's just a huge blame game being thrown about. And it ends up spawning hostilities among the different factions of humans. And there's also a mystery element behind it, a very heavy mystery element, not only because of the war and trying to figure out who's to blame, but also there's a certain person who has gone missing, and her family is searching for her to try and get her back, to get her to come home, and so there's a mystery element that expands in this. Needless to say that the plot is really, really good. It's very engaging. I really enjoyed watching the plot unfold, and of course I kind of knew what was happening from watching the show, but I was okay with that. That was totally fine by me. So let's talk a little bit about some of the people that are inhabiting this current solar system. Because as I said before, humans have colonized Mars and the asteroid belt and different other planets that they are doing research on, and so the human race is kind of cast out into the far reaches of our galaxy at this point in time. And so you've got a few different subsets of humans that have developed as a result. You've got the Earthers, as they are termed in the book, and those are the people who live on Earth and carry on their careers and their livelihoods on Earth, and they get heavily into the politics and the military aspects of protecting Earth and trying to build a utopian society, if you will. And then you also have the Martians, and these are also humans. These are the humans that colonized Mars, and Mars is very heavily involved in some of the same things that Earthers are. So they're building another human society on Mars, and one thing that sets them apart from Earthers is their technology. Their technology is much more highly advanced in many respects than the technology that Earthers have. And so there's kind of this envy and jealousy that gets in between the relations between Mars and Earth. And they've kind of got this armistice going, but they just barely tolerate each other, which is interesting because at one time Martians lived on Earth and now they live on Mars, and it's almost become an us and them situation. It's the Earthers versus the Martians when they're really all humans. And Martians are much more militaristic even than Earthers are. So that's kind of an interesting thing to watch unfold. And then you have the Belters. Now, the Belters are humans as well, but they've spent so many years, hundreds of years at this point in human evolution, living in the belt and living in a different level of gravity and sometimes hardly any gravity at all. So while they are human, their extremities look very different. Their arms are typically much longer. Their legs are typically much longer, so they stand quite a bit taller than humans, much more lanky and thin-boned and things like that. And in some circles, the Belters also have their own dialect of English. It's almost like a space Creole, if you will. It's just a completely different dialect in many respects. And it's kind of a running joke among humans based in Earth and Mars because they can't always understand the Belters. And so that makes for very interesting interactions between the three groups of humans. One thing about the Belters is there is a faction within the Belters that is very antagonistic, very anti-establishment. They are looking to upset the status quo. They're anarchists and things like that. And that is an organization known as the OPA. You might think of them in terms of the Irish Republican Army, who were known for doing sabotages and bombings and things like that. So this is the Belter equivalent of that, so to speak. It's kind of a terrorist organization, if you will, but they're more idealist, more about being recognized for their contribution to the human race, even though they're different, and even though they're stuck out on the far reaches of space in the asteroid belt. And so it's quite an interesting political dilemma. So now I want to talk about the characters. There's a lot of characters in the book, but there's only a few that I want to touch on for the purposes of this video. Now, this book is written with two different POVs that alternate back and forth between each other, and there is a third POV that is added toward the very ending of the book. So the majority of the book focuses on James Holden and Detective Miller. And then at the very end, you have a short POV from Fred Johnson. So first of all, I want to talk about James Holden. He is assigned to the Canterbury when we first start out the book. He was demoted at one point for insubordination on his previous vessel, and so now he has been assigned to the ice hauler to do ice retrieval. And he is one of the survivors when the Canterbury is destroyed. James Holden is very idealist, very purist. He believes that the best course of action in any scenario is to have everything out in the open, to be completely transparent about everything that is happening, regardless of the consequences. After the Canterbury is destroyed, he comes into some information about who might be behind the destruction of the Canterbury, and he does a galaxy-wide blast with that information and causes a whole bunch of havoc to ensue. And so he's kind of one of those guys that just puts his foot in his mouth or should put his foot in his mouth. Because oftentimes it just ends up causing more harm than good. He is not one of those guys that would say what they don't know won't hurt them. He wants everybody to know everything. And I admire that in a sense, but it gets him into a whole lot of trouble. He is from Earth. He is the offspring of a polyamorous family on Earth made up of 5 fathers and 3 mothers, and he does share the DNA of all of them. I thought that was quite interesting. I'm guessing, I didn't quite understand it, but my guess was they probably all put their stuff into a test tube and he was created out of it. I don't know for sure, not exactly how all that worked, but I'm assuming that's the case. And so he has a very interesting story, and he talks at different times about his different fathers and mothers. And of all the people in this story, he's the one that can most easily adapt to a lot of different scenarios because he's used to a lot of different gravitational pulls. And then we have Alex, who is essentially the pilot. He is a former Martian Marine, now working for the UN, and he also was aboard the Canterbury when it was destroyed, and he has gone off with James Holden on this mission to uncover the truth. Alex is quite the character. He's really bubbly and fun to be around. He almost has this Texas drawl. A lot of the Martians kind of have this like Texan accent of sorts, but he often plays it up more than it is even. You've also got Amos, who is the mechanic on board, and Amos is just a riot. He is oh my goodness, there are so many times that he said something and it was just shocking and yet absolutely hilarious. And he's one of those characters that loves shock value. And he doesn't care who he embarrasses. He doesn't care who he offends. He just speaks his mind. And that's really cool. I like Amos for that reason. He's just a fantastic character. And then we have Naomi Nagata, and she is a belter. She is also on board the Canterbury when it's destroyed, and she also goes off and follows James Holden on this mission to uncover everything. She is often referred to by Amos as the boss, even though technically James Holden is the one that comes to be in charge of the mission and things like that, but Amos always tends to call Naomi Nagata the boss. And it's just a really great dynamic between the two of them, and actually between all 3 of them, with Amos, James, and Naomi Nagata. It's just a riot sometimes. And Naomi is one of my favorite characters, both on the show and in the book. And now let's talk about Detective Miller. He is a security force detective on board a Belter space station, and his particular security force is commissioned by Earthers to police this Belter space station. And there are other people besides Belters that live on the station, but he is a Belter raised detective, and so he has the longer limbs and everything like that. And he is also one of my absolute favorite characters. He is the other main POV in this story, and he's really what gives this book in particular its cyberpunk neo-noir feel, because you've got the detective story interwoven with science fiction elements. And he has been hired by a wealthy aristocrat to track down and retrieve the aristocrat's daughter, Juliet Mal, who is an Earther, but she has taken up the cause of the Belters and the OPA, and she has run away from home and joined a Belter crew out in space. And her parents haven't heard from her in a long time, and so they've commissioned the security force on the space station to track down and retrieve their daughter. And Detective Miller gets assigned to the case. Over time, it becomes more personal for him than just an assignment, because he starts to learn things about this girl. And at the very beginning of the book, we see Juliet Mao in the opening scenes, and she is on the vessel, and something is going down, but it's not really clear what is happening. Then, flash forward to Detective Miller being on the case. He starts to learn more and more about the mission that she was on and the ship that she was on, and he ends up getting wrapped up with James Holden and his crew as he begins to realize that the case is much larger than just a kidnapping or disappearance. And so it's really cool to watch Detective Miller's story unfold as well, because he becomes an integral part of the entire story. I would say that Detective Miller is probably the main character of this story, even though James Holden plays a large part as well. Detective Miller is almost more crucial to the story than Holden is. And then the final character I want to talk about today is Fred Johnson. He is a former Earth general, and at one point he was involved in some war crimes and went dark, and nobody's kind of heard a lot from him except in certain circles. And it turns out that he has come to work for the Belt, for a space station that is building what is called a generation ship for the Mormons, believe it or not, to go off into space and grow their generations on this ship as they travel to distant galaxies, and as different members of their generation die and new ones are born and they grow up, and so that this generation ship is supposed to sustain them. So that is what Fred Johnson's space station has been designed to do, and he becomes an integral character to the story toward the end. And as the entire story begins to unfold, it becomes apparent that there is a secret organization almost detached from all of the different human societies that is working toward a goal of utilizing a new alien technology that they have discovered and using it to experiment on humans and create a new type of human race that is better able to withstand the cold reaches of space and other different environments as well. And so that is kind of their mission, but they are trying to do everything in secret. After a while, there's just no keeping it a secret anymore. Everything begins to leak, and it's just brilliantly executed. I could not put this book down, guys. It was just fantastic. All that to say, you need to read this book. I am going to talk briefly about the TV show now. The TV show is designed so that each season covers one book, which I think is a really good way to do it. At least that's what I've been told it does. And judging by season 1, I will tell you guys, if you are a fan of the show, but you have not read the books yet, like I was before I read this book, then you will find that season 1 is pretty much beat for beat directly out of the book. As I was reading the book, I'm like, oh yeah, this is exactly the way the show played out. There were a few changes. Some characters got more screen time, got a little bit more added to their character. Some love interests were expanded a little bit. But overall, season 1 copied the book beat for beat. And I like that. That's what I like to see in my adaptations. because I want to be able to see what I've read on the page and vice versa. So what I like about the way I did it is, having come from the show, I'm able to get a better picture of the characters in the book in my head. And the reason that's important to me is, even though the characters are great, they're kind of one-dimensional at times, especially James Holden. So in the TV show, James Holden is much more nuanced, so I really enjoyed that aspect of it. But that's not to say the book is bad in any way, shape, or form. It's not. It's a fantastic read. But just keep that in mind, that some of the characters are a little more nuanced in the show than they were in the book. And I'm sure as the books go on, it will become more nuanced over time. But I've heard people say that they really don't like James Holden in the book, and I actually quite liked him. But maybe I'm biased because I already had a feeling of what he was like from watching the show. So, just an excellent, excellent adaptation. The ending was spot on from the book as well. They didn't make a whole lot of changes at all, so I was really, really impressed with that. Who knows what it will be like as I read more of the books, whether or not it will diverge from the books or not on the TV show, but so far I'm really impressed, and I highly recommend watching the TV show as well. It is a wild ride, guys, and I had so much fun watching it. So this is a book that I think any science fiction fan should read. I think it appeals strongly to a lot of fantasy readers as well. Even though it is strictly science fiction, it has a lot of strong character development that you have come to expect from fantasy novels. So it's not your really hard sci-fi epic where it's kind of wooden and dry and more of an information dump than an actual glimpse into the world and characters' lives. There's a lot of strong world building in this book. So absolutely loved it. I highly recommend it. I think you'll love it too. And let me know in the comments if you read this book. I would be curious to hear your thoughts on it. And make sure you guys are reading more books. I'll talk to you soon.